Hi, U.S. history friends. Mr. Sherman again. You might remember me from such classes as U.S. History B, which we had for a grand total of 3.5 days. But what I've decided to do today is talk a little bit about something that we normally wouldn't talk about in U.S. history, simply because it deals with Europe, and that is the Battle of Britain. It's still an extremely important part of World War II, and I would like to talk about it, but we just don't get to. So, here's the deal, friends. During the summer and autumn of 1940, Germany and Great Britain came head-to-head in something called the Battle of Britain, which was an all-air war. Really kind of a cool conflict. But to get a little bit of background, you need to know that since September of 1939, Hitler's blitzkrieg had really been on a roll. You start from Poland, and then you go to Scandinavia, eventually the Low Countries, and then you have the fall of France, and subsequently the British withdrawal at Dunkirk. And so really, basically all of Europe is under the control of Germany at this point, either allied, neutral, or defeated. And so what happens is Hitler takes a look across the channel and he's like, okay, well, England has to give up. But Great Britain didn't give up. They lost most of their equipment, most of their small arms, basically their entire military except for their people and their navy and their aircraft, the RAF, or the Royal Air Force. That was still intact. And so Hitler decided, okay, well, it's about ready to plan some kind of a cross-channel invasion. And so he starts to think about, how are we going to make this happen? Well, in order to have something called Operation Sea Lion, you're going to have to control two things. You're going to have to control the air, and the reason you have to control the air is because you have to control the Royal Navy. If the Royal Navy can go up and down the English Channel, there's no way Germany is going to be able to shuttle troops from probably occupied France into Great Britain. You're just not going to be able to do it. And doing a massive parachute drop probably wasn't going to be terribly effective, even though he might have tried that. So here's the deal. Air superiority, take out the Royal Air Force, and you have to take out the Royal Navy. And so here's what's going to happen. In order to do that, you have to do things like take out the radar stations. You have to take out the airfields that are on the coast. And it's going to be an interesting thing. So here's the deal. Hermann Goering comes up with this plan. He's going to use the Luftwaffe alone, which is the German Air Force. And he's going to send the Luftwaffe up against the RAF. And this is going to start really in June. They start some probing attacks and going after radar stations and going after some of the coastal airfields and things like that. The reason that the radar is important is it is going to give the British a real advantage, because they can eventually see the German planes heading toward Great Britain. They can eventually get an idea of the altitude and possibly their destination, and that allows the British to vector their forces only where they're needed, and that's going to be extremely helpful in the upcoming battle. Well, so here's what happens. By July, something called Kanalkampf occurs, and you start to see dive bomber attacks with the Ju-87 Stukas attacking British shipping, their merchant fleets, just the idea that they could starve the British and try to sink the fleet. By August, what we have is really the Eagle attack, and that is the real beginning of the Battle of Britain. This is the all-out assault, and within days, this is going to be an all-out battle. And it's going to occur over the skies over Great Britain. And in just a few days, it's going to lead Winston Churchill to state that never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few, and he was talking about the RAF. All right, here's the deal. It was working. Germany launched fighter planes and dive bombers and regular level bombers, and they hit the German airfields, they hit the radar stations. When the British would come up to meet them, they were getting shot down in numbers that they just couldn't maintain. A plane is one thing, it's valuable, it's expensive. A pilot's quite another. Pilots are much more expensive, and they take a long time to produce. Not only training-wise, but you also have to grow them up from infants to become adults. It takes a long time to do this. It's very expensive, and it's demoralizing. It really is. When day after day you're flying and you're seeing your buddies get shot down, it's a very difficult thing. So here's the deal. It was working for the Germans. It looked like they were going to wipe the RAF off of the face of the earth, and then they'd have an open avenue for the cross-channel invasion. But then something happened. Really, it ended up in was it August 23rd or something like that. There was potentially some errant bombing of London. We don't know if it was planned or not, but needless to say, London was bombed, and the RAF and Bomber Command is going to respond by eventually bombing Berlin. That's going to anger Hitler, and he's going to kind of shift his focus away from taking out the RAF into bombing the people of London, figuring out if you bomb them and the civilians and you make their life miserable, that their government is going to eventually give up and surrender. All right? But by September 15th, what is now known as the Battle of Britain Day occurred, and that was when there was a complete shift, and the Germans started to lose the Battle of Britain. And by October 31st, essentially the battle was over. Let's pause right here, and normally I put a commercial here. I just don't have anything to have a commercial about. So, oh, I'm glad you guys stuck around. One of the really interesting things about the Battle of Britain is the fact that it was a really close thing. If the British had lost, there was nothing to stop Hitler. I mean, really. Because Great Britain won, Hitler's going to shift his attention somewhere else. It's going to allow Great Britain to basically remoralize itself and refit itself, and then eventually, very soon, the United States is going to get involved. All right, but here's the deal. At the beginning of the Battle of Britain, the Luftwaffe had 1,029 fighter aircraft. The RAF had about 900. They're really similar. The Luftwaffe also had almost 1,000 bombers. They didn't have any heavy bombers. They're mostly medium bombers. And they had, oh my goodness, like 250 or so, I can't remember exactly, maybe 300 dive bombers. Those would be Me-110s and Ju-87 Stukas. But here's the deal. Part of the reason that the British are going to win this is they were fighting a battle of defense. The Germans could pick and choose where they attacked, but because the British kind of had an idea of where they were coming from, they could sit back and kind of wait. And it was up to the Germans to attack because the Germans had to defeat the RAF. All the RAF had to do was survive and not give up. That's a big deal. Great Britain also had a very effective, established air defense network that was basically a system of radios and phone lines and radar operators that worked, and you could coordinate all of that information so that you could figure out very quickly where the enemy was, and you could then use your forces to go after them. You could also use your ground forces and your anti-aircraft artillery and things like that, and you could give them ample warning so they could be ready. And so the Germans had to fly into, let's say they're a bomber, they had to fly into an area. The German bombers had to worry about enemy fighters, and they also had to worry about anti-aircraft fire. So it was pretty rough on the Germans. One of the other things that you should know is that during this battle, both sides used planes that were roughly similar. The Germans used the Bf-109. Most of them were the E version. On average, they were about 340 miles an hour. They could go about 400 miles, which is extremely important. If you can only go 400 miles, all right, and you can go 340 miles an hour, here's the math. If you go 340 miles an hour, how long can you go on a full tank of gas? Well, you can go about an hour, because you want to make sure that you have enough gas to land, get home, things like that. So you're going to take off, fly over enemy airspace, and then have to get back across the English Channel pretty darn quickly. So you don't have a lot of time over the target. And that was a real problem that hampered the Bf-109. It was just a real problem. They had interesting armament, two 7.92 millimeter machine guns in the cowling. They also had two 20 millimeter cannons in the wings. And so it was a pretty formidable weapon. They could outclimb and outdive the British planes for the most part. I'll explain. They also had a fuel injection system which allowed the German planes to do this. They could really quickly dive because fuel was injected into the engine rather than using gravity. If a British plane did this really fast, it would stall and possibly flood the engine. And that's a real problem. So often what you would see is British planes could either go down slowly or you could do this, and that was possible. All right. The Bf-109 was notoriously tough to land because the landing gear was really close to the fuselage of the plane. So it wasn't extremely forgiving. But overall, the Bf-109 was an amazing aircraft. It really was. Extremely effective. The British are going to counter the Bf-109 with the Spitfire, the Supermarine Spitfire, and the Hawker Hurricane. Both of those planes were about 330 miles an hour, so only slightly slower than the Bf-109. But both the Spitfire and the Hurricane could outturn the 109. And so the 109 could go up and down a little bit faster, but the Spitfire and the Hurricane could turn a little bit faster. And so you had to play to your plane's strengths. Also, the Bf-109 was a little bit faster. All right, but here's the deal. The planes themselves are extremely similar in their capabilities. And what it comes down to is, for the most part, tactics, also strategy, and then it came down to the individual pilot. Basically, if you're a really good pilot, any of those planes you could be successful in, really. All right, so here's the deal. During the Battle of Britain, it's going to come down to this. It wasn't just the planes, it wasn't just the pilots. It came down to basically two groups. One is the British people. And the British people decided they were going to continue to resist. They were going to outlast the Germans. They just weren't going to surrender. Didn't matter. Now, it helped that the Germans shifted their attacks onto London, and that's going to allow the RAF to kind of lick its wounds and come back stronger. But the British people said, no, we're not going to give up. And the other group of people is really more led by Hitler himself. Goering wanted to keep going. Hitler had his mind somewhere else. He's like, you know what? This is basically a sideshow. I could take care of Great Britain whenever I want. The real enemy is the Soviet Union. And he's going to eventually launch Operation Barbarossa, which is the invasion of the Soviet Union. So his eye was off this ball onto a completely different field. And so what's going to happen is Great Britain just refused to surrender. And the Germans left. And because of that, the Battle of Britain was won by Great Britain. Hitler is going to really, really suffer at the hands of the Red Army. we'll talk about that in a later episode. But thank you guys for stopping in and listening, and I hope that you guys are healthy. I hope you're safe, and I hope to see you really soon. I miss a few of you. All right, see you guys. A few.